Tonight we slip into the cobblestoned hush of a medieval town, where the moonlight gleams like spilled milk on crooked roofs. You're moving slow, your boots tapping lightly, careful not to wake the dogs that look more like disgruntled wolves. A chill nips at your nose, but that's not what grabs your attention, it's the strange sight ahead. Men in long robes clutching feathers the size of small swords. And not just any feathers, these are gleaming, sculpted things, jutting out like flags of prestige. You're about to follow them, because, well, your curiosity is nosier than your sense of self-preservation. And honestly, you probably won't survive this century, not with your soft modern hands and love for Wi-Fi. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and the time you're tuning in. I love seeing where these journeys take us across the globe. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You creep closer, and here's the first thing you notice. These feathers aren't tucked away in belts like an afterthought. They're being carried like symbols, bold and unapologetic, brushing shoulders and swinging at knees. Imagine if lawyers today dragged around pool noodles in public. That's the level of weird you're witnessing. A notary in 1350 didn't just own a quill, he wielded it like a badge, and sometimes even as a passport. But right now, all you hear is the crisp click of boots on stone, echoing through alleys that smell faintly of smoke, bread crust, and the kind of sewage that makes you grateful for indoor plumbing. The air hums with an odd tension, as though words themselves have weight, and those words are locked inside the men you're tailing. Their robes sway like shadows, and the feather pens jut out, pale against the darkness, so large they seem almost theatrical. One curves like a falcon's wing, another spirals with decorative cuts so neat you can tell someone wasted an entire afternoon making it look fancy. You try not to giggle, because honestly, if you saw this in a modern coffee shop, you'd assume it's an improved group rehearsing. Here's the kicker, those oversized quills weren't for show alone. They screamed, "I am literate, and I have power," in a world where most people couldn't even sign their own names. Literacy back then was like having a verified checkmark on your social profile, rare, envied, and a little smug. And notaries? They weren't just note-takers. They were trusted enough to draft contracts, validate deals, and occasionally, ruin someone's day with a few strokes of ink. The papal chancery in Avignon? Oh, those folks could crush your ambitions with one official flourish. Now, why so big? Historians still argue whether the extravagance came from practicality or pure flexing. A long feather gave you balance for sweeping strokes on parchment, sure, but did anyone really need a plume long enough to double as a back scratcher? Some say it was ergonomic, others swear it was pure pageantry. Personally, I think it was the medieval version of carrying a phone with 3 camera lenses. You don't need all of them, but it feels good to flash them. As you follow the robed men deeper into the alley, lanterns glow like captured stars, illuminating faces creased from squinting at manuscripts. Their ink-stained fingers twitch slightly, as if still tracing invisible lines in the air. You catch a murmur, domani, la firma, tomorrow, the signature. Deals that could topple fortunes are wrapped in hushed syllables, and those monstrous quills will seal them. If pens are swords, these guys are knights. Except instead of armor, they've got goose feathers and enough ink to drown a cat. You pause near an open window and peek in. Inside, a desk squats under a mountain of parchment, like a bleached hill. A candle flickers nervously as a clerk sharpens his quill with a tiny knife called a penknife. Yes, that's where the word comes from. Chips of feather fall like dandruff on the table. The whole process feels almost surgical. And you think about your ballpoint pen, click, scribble, done. Where's the drama in that? Back then, writing was practically a lifestyle. But let's not romanticize everything. It was messy. Ink stains crawled up sleeves, blots bled like guilty secrets, and every sneeze was a potential apocalypse. Imagine spending 3 hours drafting a royal charter, then Urachu. Game over. The medieval world had zero tolerance for Control plus Z. So yeah, if you ever time travel here, pack tissues and a steady hand. Now, let's toss in a fringe detail because bedtime stories love those. Some notaries, brace yourself, perfumed their quills. That's right. Lavender, rose water, even musk. Why? To impress clients. To mask the smell of drying parchment, which could be pungent. Or maybe they were just extra. Historians shrug on this one, still arguing whether it was widespread or a niche habit among the fabulously vain. Picture it, a legal clerk swanning into court, plume swaying, quill smelling faintly like grandma's soap. Oh, the scandal. As you trail the last notary toward a square, the bells toll midnight, their bronze throats humming across the rooftops. You pull your cloak tighter, heart pattering like distant rain, because something in this quiet pageantry feels almost sacred. These men, with their giant feathers, are more than scribes, they are architects of promises, guardians of legality in an age when a wrong word could spark a feud that lasts generations. And yet, their greatest weapon is a hollow shaft of bone wrapped in fluff. You wonder if centuries from now, someone will whisper about us, why we carried glowing rectangles everywhere, like talismans. Maybe they'll laugh, the way you're smiling now, in this alley thick with ink and secrets. Keep walking. The story's just begun. You keep your pace steady, the rhythm of your boots echoing off the stone as the notaries ahead melt into the warm glow spilling from a nearby building. You slip closer and glance through a warped glass window. Inside, the air seems heavy with the scent of beeswax candles and something sharper, ink, metallic and slightly sour. Quills jut from pots like hedgehog spines, and on the table, parchments lie open, ink lines curling like vines across their pale skin. You're witnessing a guild chamber. That word alone, guild, sounds cozy, but trust me, it's as soft as a brick wall. These weren't casual meetups over tankards, they were iron-fisted clubs, complete with secrets, codes, and oaths so binding you'd think you were joining a secret society that drafts reality itself. Notaries weren't freelancers roaming the streets with whimsical feathers, they were gatekeepers of truth, and their guilds held serious clout. If you wanted legitimacy, you went through them. Without their ink blessing, your contracts were basically scribbles on glorified napkins. One man, grey hair curled like question marks, stands at the head of the room. His reading from a ledger so thick it could double as a murder weapon. The others nod gravely, their quills laid neatly before them. You lean in, catching a word or two. Tabellio, Latin for notary. Feels official, doesn't it? That's because in the medieval world, this role had roots stretching back to Roman law. When the empire crumbled like a stale biscuit, fragments of that system stuck, and in cities like Bologna and Venice, notaries became the mortar holding society together. Here's a mainstream fact. By the 13th century, notaries were licensed by local authorities or even the Pope himself. Their signatures weren't just ink, they carried legal magic. A document sealed by a notary could decide property disputes, inheritance, even marriages. Your Netflix subscription terms? Child's play compared to the land charters these guys churned out. But now for the quirky tidbit. Some guilds required initiates to swear an oath not just on the Bible, but on a literal inkpot. Yes, as in, do you solemnly swear, over this puddle of black goo? The symbolism was crystal clear, your words were binding as ink. Historians still argue whether this was universal or just one of those local oddities that spiraled into legend. Either way, it's wonderfully bizarre, and you kind of want to try it next time someone borrows your phone charger. You slip inside the room now, in your imagination of course, because if you physically walked in wearing sneakers and a hoodie, someone would faint into the quill bin. The sound in here is hypnotic, the faint rasp of a penknife carving a new nib, the whispery drag of feather tips across parchment, punctuated by the occasional sniff or throat clear. These men, sometimes women, though rarer, aren't just writing. They're performing. Every loop and curve is deliberate because style mattered. Bold strokes signaled confidence. Neat, compressed script hinted at frugality and control. One notary, his plume arched like a question mark, dips into an inkpot and begins drafting what looks like a contract. The letters bloom, black and assertive, like little soldiers marching across a battlefield of calfskin. You're tempted to lean over and whisper, "Nice kerning," but you'd probably be escorted out by someone with a very sharp penknife. And here's the kicker. These guilds didn't just regulate writing, they policed ethics. If you forged a document, banned for life. Overcharge a client, fined. Get caught working outside your jurisdiction. May the saints have mercy, because the guild wouldn't. Some even staged surprise inspections. Imagine being a medieval auditor creeping up on a scribe mid-parchment. "Excuse me, sir, is that an authorized flourish?" The tension in the room thickens as the grey-haired leader announces names for tomorrow's assignments. A land dispute in Florence. A debt acknowledgement in Siena. Each task is a thread in the tapestry of medieval society, and without these ink-bound promises, cities would unravel into chaos. You suddenly appreciate your click-to-accept e-contracts a whole lot more. One man pockets his quill carefully, sliding it into a leather sheath at his belt. You notice it again, the size. The thing practically grazes his knee as he walks. Why so enormous? Partly tradition, partly intimidation. Bigger feather, bigger status. Some even dyed them reds, blues, a peacock green that made legal circles look like a parade float. Practical? Not really. Fabulous? Absolutely. Historians still argue whether this flamboyance was endorsed by guild codes or just tolerated as long as you didn't drip ink on the charter. Suddenly, a chuckle ripples through the room. Someone cracked a joke about a rival guild botching a dowry clause, apparently. That's high comedy here. You don't get it, but you laugh softly anyway, because that's what polite guests do. Humor in this world runs on parchment and pride, not memes and cat videos. Outside, the bells toll again, deeper this time, like the city exhaling. You follow the notary with the green-dyed plume as he steps into the night. His breath fogs in the cold air, and the feather sways with every stride, a silent declaration of authority. You can't help wondering, does he sleep with that thing? Or maybe he props it by the bed, like a knight with his sword. And just as that thought hits you, a draft sneaks down the alley, making your own fingers twitch. For the first time, you wish you had a feather too, not for writing, but for waving dramatically every time someone questions your life choices. And so you walk on, the secrets of the guild trailing behind you like candle smoke. You keep shadowing the plume parade down a street that smells faintly of roasted chestnuts and damp wool. The cobblestones glisten under the lantern glow like polished coins, and every step brings you deeper into the question that's been itching your brain. Were these monstrous feathers just tools, or were they something more? The next notary you spot makes you think you have your answer. His strutting, not walking, not trudging, strutting, as if the night air were his personal red carpet. His robe swishes dramatically, and from his belt swings a quill so lavish it looks stolen from a peacock mid-preen. Iridescent green, shimmering like dragon scales in the lamplight, the plume almost mocks the darkness around it. You half expect a fanfare to start playing. Here's the reality. In a society obsessed with hierarchy, even your pen game mattered. These weren't simple geese feathers hacked and hollowed, they were fashion statements, legal bling, the medieval equivalent of a luxury wristwatch. Some quills were dyed in exotic hues, others trimmed with microscopic precision so they curved like elegant talons. The bigger and fancier your feather, the louder you shouted, "I'm educated. I'm official." And yes, my ink stains cost more than your boots. Mainstream fact for you, Notaries often worked closely with city councils, merchants, and noble families, drafting charters, treaties, and wills. This wasn't side hustle energy, they were essential infrastructure. Without their scrolls and signatures, commerce would seize like a rusty hinge. Towns thrived on paper promises, and the guy with the flamboyant quill, he was the linchpin. Now for the quirky twist. Some notaries wore their feathers stuck in caps or fastened dramatically to robes, even outside of work. Like, yes, I'm here for the feast, but in case anyone wants a quick contract, I'm ready. Imagine turning up to a wedding today with your laptop chained to your neck for the same reason. Historians still argue whether this habit was about convenience or just a colossal ego trip. Maybe both. You keep walking, trailing the strutter into a square where a fountain gurgles softly, its basin iced at the edges. He stops under a lantern and begins chatting with another scribe, his quill plain, utilitarian, the beige Camry of feathers. The contrast is almost comedic. You linger near a column and eavesdrop on a conversation that sounds like humble brag meets medieval shade. Words like scriptura and authenticum float through the chill. You don't understand every syllable, but the tone says it all. They're comparing strokes, literally. And here's where it gets even better. The guilds may have regulated behavior, but style? That was the Wild West. Long plumes meant prestige, but length had limits. Too short, and you looked like an amateur. Too long, and people whispered you were compensating. Seriously, you can practically hear the gossip. Did you see Giovanni's quill? Over 2 spans long. Tragic. The soundscape around you hums with life, distant hooves clopping, laughter spilling from a tavern, a lute whining a melancholy tune. You glance at the fountain again and notice something. The water reflects the quills like spears pointing skyward. Suddenly, it clicks. These weren't just writing tools. They were banners, emblems of intellectual knighthood. No wonder they flaunted them. Let's drop another fun tidbit. Some quills were carved with tiny inscriptions, Latin mottos, pious prayers, even inside jokes no one outside their circle would get. Imagine squinting at your colleague's pen only to read, Carpe diem etched along the shaft. Talk about extra. As you keep following, a wind slaps your face, carrying the smoky tang of hearth fires. You duck your head and chuckle at the absurdity, all this drama for feathers. But then again, fashion today worships sneakers that cost a month's rent, so maybe nothing's changed. Humans love turning tools into trophies. You trail them to an archway leading toward what smells like fresh parchment and candle soot. A dog barks somewhere, sharp and impatient. Inside, a small gathering pulses with chatter and quill flourishes. This isn't just business, it's theater. You catch sight of a quill so outrageous it could double as a fan for a minor noblewoman. The owner twirls it absent-mindedly as he debates ink ratios like a sommelier describing tannins. You fight the urge to roll your eyes, because frankly, it's glorious. Historians still argue whether these ostentatious displays were tolerated because they kept morale high or because nobody dared call out the quill elite. Either way, those feathers weren't leaving fashion anytime soon. And why should they? When your livelihood depends on handwriting that could outlive dynasties, a little vanity feels justified. As you slip back into the street, the wind dies, and the silence swells like a held breath. Somewhere behind you, laughter bursts, bright and brittle, like ink splattering across clean parchment. You imagine tomorrow, those same quills dancing over calfskin, shaping marriages, dividing estates, maybe igniting wars, all while looking fabulous. And now, the night stretches ahead like a blank page. What will it hold? Keep walking, you're about to find out. You move deeper into the heart of the city, following that whispery trail of parchment and ink, until you catch the glow of a room where light spills like molten gold across flagstones. It's a workshop bigger than the ones you've seen so far, and when you slip closer, the air thickens with the warm, fatty tang of treated skins. That's when it hits you: parchment isn't paper. It's animal. And medieval notaries knew this truth better than anyone. Picture a calf's hide stretched tight across a wooden frame, pale and veined, like some strange drum waiting to be played. A boy in a wool tunic scrapes the surface with a crescent blade, flakes curling like snow at his feet. You shiver because it's both fascinating and a little unsettling. Every contract, every testament, every royal charter begins here, with patience, precision, and more than a little smell. Here's your mainstream fact: parchment was king in Europe for centuries because it lasted. Unlike fragile paper, parchment could survive centuries if stored well. And when your goal is to immortalize property rights or a pope's decree, you want something that won't crumble faster than a biscotti in hot tea. But let's talk about the problem. Parchment was slow. Drying could take days. Preparing it, weeks. So while a client waits for a quick marriage contract, you, the notary, are at the mercy of drying hides and temperamental weather. Rainy week. Congratulations, you just delayed someone's wedding. Makes you wish for a medieval version of express shipping. You edge farther in and see stacks of parchment sheets leaning like toppled towers, their edges rough and faintly oily. Each one is a small fortune. And because they're so pricey, every square inch matters. Waste a page with sloppy script, and you're not just embarrassing yourself, you're eating into your client's coin. That's why notaries practiced their handwriting like athletes training for the Olympics. Calligraphy wasn't art here, it was survival. Now for the quirky tidbit: some parchment makers used lime baths so strong they could strip hair faster than a modern wax kit. And rumor has it that in lean years, when calfskins were scarce, folks recycled old parchments by scraping them down, a practice called palimpsesting. Historians still argue whether this was common among notaries or mostly in monasteries, but imagine erasing last year's marriage contract to draft a land sale. Awkward. You watch a notary enter the room, quill swinging like a pendulum. He inspects the parchment stack, his expression pinched with calculation. Does he splurge on the thick sheet for that merchant treaty? Or gamble on a thinner one and pray no ink bleeds through? Decisions, decisions. Meanwhile, his assistant grinds oak galls into powder, mixing them with iron salts and wine to make ink blacker than midnight despair. It smells sharp and sour, like a potion you'd hesitate to drink. Historians adore these details because they turn ink into drama. Too much acid, and the letters bite so deep they scar the parchment. Too little, and your strokes fade like ghost whispers. The margin for error? Slimmer than a goose quill. You lean against the doorway and think about how different this feels from your click-tap life. Today, if you botch a document, you hit delete and move on. Back then, every blot was a tiny tragedy. A sneeze at the wrong moment could doom an entire folio. And yes, people sneezed on parchment because they were human and because medieval winters didn't come with central heating. Imagine spending 6 hours drafting a will only to, achoo, drop a perfect Rorschach test on a duke's inheritance. There's no emoji for that pain. Your eyes drift to a shelf lined with pumice stones. They're for smoothing rough spots on parchment, but in the candlelight, they look like relics of some mystical rite. And in a way, this is ritual. Every stage, from hide to quill stroke, carries a solemnity you can almost feel vibrating in the air. And here's something fun for your sleepy brain. Some contracts were written so tightly, with barely a fingernail of margin, that they look like microscopic forests. Why? Because parchment was expensive, and thrift was a virtue even in aesthetics. You imagine a notary hunched over, cramming words into every crevice, muttering, "No space for your fancy flourish today, Matteo." Historians still argue whether this drive for economy birthed certain scripts, those angular Gothic hands that look like spiky hedges on a page. Was it efficiency? Or pure fashion creeping in under the guise of practicality? Either way, the result is mesmerizing. As the candles gutter low, shadows pool in corners, and the sound of scraping hides softens into a lullaby of monotony. The notary gathers his sheets, handling them like spun glass. Each one represents not just a blank canvas, but hours of labor, the echo of a calf's life, and the promise of permanence. You feel a strange reverence as he steps into the night, quill bouncing gently at his side. And you follow, because where there's parchment, there's ink, and where there's ink, stories bloom like midnight flowers. The street tightens into a ribbon of mud and moonlight, twisting past shuttered shops and looming archways. You pull your cloak tighter, well, in your head you do, because the wind here cuts like it's filing complaints. Ahead, you see your notary friend from earlier, quill still bobbing like an overgrown feather duster strapped to his belt. He trudges steadily, leather boots sucking at the muck with every step. And suddenly, you realize, this guy is putting in serious mileage. That's the thing people forget, being a notary wasn't all cozy desks and candlelit scribbling. It was a traveling gig. You didn't just sit and wait for clients to appear like moths to parchment. If someone needed a contract signed at the market, or a dowry recorded at a countryside manor, guess who packed up their portable desk? Yep, our quill-wielding hero. Mainstream fact check. In many Italian city-states during the 13th and 14th centuries, notaries were licensed regionally, and their authority often traveled with them. A document drawn up by a recognized notary could be valid across multiple jurisdictions. That meant clients chased them down, and sometimes, they chased clients. Picture a medieval LinkedIn profile, specializing in debt settlements and long walks through mud. You slog behind him, imagining the weight he carries, parchment rolls bound in leather straps, ink pots sealed with wax, and a pouch of sand for blotting mistakes. Forget your laptop bag, this was like hauling an entire art supply store. And then there's the quill, absurdly long, swaying with every stride like a showy reminder, this guy means business. Or maybe just drama. Quirky tidbit time, some notaries carried collapsible desks. Yep, like the medieval version of a pop-up workstation. They'd set up in a courtyard or tavern corner, feather and ink at the ready, turning any space into an office. Historians still argue whether these desks were common or more of a luxury, but the image of a robed man dramatically unfolding his desk like a magician pulling out a tablecloth. Chef's kiss. As the road dips toward a narrow bridge, your boots squish through a puddle, and the air smells faintly of horse and river weed. The notary pauses, adjusts his quill, and glances at a scrap of parchment, probably an appointment list inked so tight it looks like a spider's diary. You catch names, something about a vineyard contract, maybe a grain delivery agreement. You imagine each transaction as a quiet hinge on which entire households turn. Marriages sealed, debts acknowledged, vendettas avoided, all with ink and words. And yet, there's risk here. You glance around and notice the shadows are thicker than the air likes to admit. Highwaymen loved roads like this, and notaries were prime targets. Why? Because parchment meant contracts, and contracts meant money. Some even carried official seals worth more than a farm. Lose that, and your guild would flay you alive, figuratively, hopefully. He strides on, and you wonder how he keeps the ink from freezing on nights like this. Maybe he tucks the pots inside his cloak, close to his body heat. Maybe he whispers threats at them. Either way, ink was temperamental. Too cold, and it clotted. Too warm, and it bled. You marvel at the absurd balancing act this job demanded. Half writer, half traveling chemist, full-time diplomat of dripping liquids. Historians still argue whether these men traveled alone or in small bands for safety. Some claim notaries tagged along with merchants' caravans, scribbling as they went. Others think they roamed solo, relying on local hospitality and their guild reputation to keep knives out of their ribs. Whatever the truth, the road was no joke. The bridge groans under your steps, wood slick with frost. Below, a river mutters dark secrets, carrying broken reeds and the occasional whiff of decay. Your notary barely notices, probably too focused on making his next deadline, because yes, even in the Middle Ages, deadlines were monsters. Miss one, and you didn't just lose a client, you could lose credibility faster than a quill loses barbs. By the time he reaches the far bank, your legs ache in sympathy. The city thins out into patches of farmland, furrows glinting like scars in the moonlight. Somewhere, a dog barks and then stops, like it knows better. Ahead, a farmhouse squats under a sagging roof, smoke curling from its chimney. The notary knocks once, twice, and the door creaks open to reveal a farmer blinking in the candle glow. Voices murmur, low, deliberate, and then you hear the rustle of parchment unfurling like a pale tongue. Inside, the air glows honeygold and reeks of hay and sweat. The notary kneels at a crude table, his giant feather sweeping shadows across the wall as he writes. The contract, something about leasing fields, takes shape in black, elegant strokes, each letter a miniature fortress. The farmer leans close, squinting, because reading isn't his forte. No matter. The notary reads aloud in sonorous tones, sealing trust with cadence and ink. When it's done, the feather snaps upward, scattering a droplet of ink like a punctuation mark in midair. The farmer presses his mark, a crude X, and exhales as if a weight just rolled off his shoulders. And you're grinning, because for all the mud, the danger, the sheer inconvenience, this feels profound. A promise, born on the road, anchored in parchment, carried by a man who treats his feather like a scepter. Outside, the stars blink like sleepy candles. You step back into the cold, boots sinking into mud that seems endless. Ahead, the notary hoists his satchel, adjusts his plume, and starts walking again. And you, faithful shadow, follow, because tomorrow will bring another deal, another journey, another story inked in the folds of night. The road curls like a ribbon of frost under your feet, and the notary strides on, quill bobbing against his hip with the grace of a swan stuck on a leash. You watch it glint under the weak moonlight, and a thought creeps in. That feather isn't just decoration. It's a passport, a literal key to the world of law and legitimacy in a society built on handwritten vows. See, here's the big truth. In medieval Europe, a notary wasn't simply someone who could write, he was someone sanctioned to make words official. Your average town scribe could draft a love poem or a shopping list, sure. But if you needed something that could stand up in court or survive a papal audit without triggering divine side-eye, you wanted that guy, the one with the license, the seal, and yes, the giant quill swaying like an exclamation mark. Mainstream fact time. By the late 13th century, many cities required notaries to pass examinations and take oaths before magistrates or bishops. Their authority was so entrenched that even kings and popes recognized their work. Imagine strolling into a civic court without a notary-authenticated deed, you'd be laughed out of the room faster than someone trying to pay taxes in Monopoly money. But the feather? That was the shortcut to credibility. Walk into a council chamber, plume gleaming like a holy relic, and everyone knew, this man's words carry weight. In a society where signatures were rare and seals guarded like family jewels, the quill was both pen and permit. No quill, no entry. That's why notaries never left home without one. It was their badge, their brand, their don't talk to me unless you need legal magic vibe. And oh, the drama this sparked. Quirky tidbit for your dreams, some notaries decorated their quills with colored threads, tassels, or even tiny bells, yes, bells, so that when they walked, their feather jingled like a festive parade. Historians still argue whether this was tolerated by guilds or just one guy in Florence who really liked making an entrance. Either way, you can almost hear it. Ting-a-ling, your lawsuit awaits. You trail behind as the notary approaches a bustling square, the kind that smells of stale ale and ambition. Merchants huddle under makeshift awnings, shouting about wool prices and grain shortages, while a donkey brays like it's auditioning for a solo. The notary cuts through the chaos with quiet authority, plume wagging like a mute herald. People notice. A butcher elbows his apprentice and mutters something about Illinois Tobelio, eyes lingering on the feather like it's a gold chain. And why wouldn't they? That quill signals literacy in a world where most people couldn't sign their own names. It says, "I speak the language of law," and in doing so, it elevates its owner above the common fray. In a sense, the feather is more than a tool, it's theater, a visual cue that transforms ink into legitimacy. Without it, you're just another guy scribbling in the corner. With it, you're a walking institution. The notary stops at a stall stacked with scrolls like ivory serpents. He exchanges greetings with a merchant whose hands look permanently tattooed with soot. They haggle softly, words curling around the smell of chestnuts and damp wool. You catch fragments: lease, surety, 2 witnesses. The feather dips as the notary leans in, and you can almost feel the contract forming midair, invisible but binding, like an incantation waiting for ink. And here's a fun image to tuck under your pillow tonight. Without a quill, this whole transaction collapses. No writing tool, no document, no deal. So what happens if a notary loses his feather? Panic. Full-scale, guild-fined panic. Some statutes even required notaries to carry multiple quills, just in case disaster struck. Because if you show up empty-handed, you might as well be naked in court. Historians still argue whether quills doubled as identifiers in crowded civic spaces, like show your feather to get through security. There's no hard proof, but the anecdotal evidence is delicious. Imagine a doorman blocking your way. "Sorry, sir, no quill, no entry." You dig through your satchel, muttering about how it was just there, while behind you, someone jingles smugly past with bells on their plume. As dusk thickens, the square flickers with torchlight, shadows shivering against stone walls. The notary finishes his business, tucks the scroll into his satchel, and strides off, quill bobbing like a metronome to the beat of history. You follow, boots kissing cobblestones slick with spilled ale, and your thoughts swirl like ink in water. This isn't just stationery, it's sovereignty, distilled into a feather shaft. You wonder, idly, what your modern passport would look like if designed by these guys. Probably a leather scroll with gold leaf, signed in blood and sealed with wax the size of a fist. No wonder their paperwork felt like a workout. Ahead, the road narrows into an alley where the air tastes of soot and secrets. You catch the flicker of another plume rounding the corner, and your pulse skips like a stone across a pond. 2 notaries in one place. Feathers will fly, or maybe they'll just compare nib angles like gym bros swapping protein tips. Either way, you're not missing this. You slip closer, heartbeat syncing with the soft tap of boots and the rustle of parchment. And in the glow of a guttering torch, 2 men face each other, quills gleaming like unsheathed blades. Stay tuned. This is about to get spicy. The alley is narrow, the kind that feels like it was carved out for secrets. The stones glisten with yesterday's rain, and the cold air carries a hint of smoke, damp wool, and something sharper like ambition hanging in the fog. You press your back to the wall, just far enough to stay in the shadows, and watch the scene unfold. 2 notaries face each other under a guttering torch, and the feathers, they're outrageous. One, sleek and disciplined, snow-white with the faintest pearl sheen, like an aristocrat's sigh. The other, a riot of color, streaked with crimson and gold threads that catch the firelight in tiny explosions. It's not just a quill, it's a peacock that survived a rave. You almost want to clap, but these men aren't here to entertain you. Their voices start low, measured, but there's an edge slicing through the politeness. Something about jurisdiction, maybe a disputed contract. You catch a word, authentica. That's serious business. And suddenly, it clicks, this isn't a friendly chat. This is status in motion, feathers flaring like medieval power ties. Here's your mainstream fact, Feather size and quality could signal rank. Guild regulations often dictated practical norms, but within those lines, notaries indulged in their own quiet arms race. A goose feather might say solid professional, while a swan plume whispered patronage connections. Peacock. That screamed my family owns half the vineyards outside Florence. Historians still argue whether these displays were sanctioned or just tolerated with a sigh, but you know how humans are, we can turn anything into a status symbol, even bird anatomy. Now for the quirky nugget. There are scattered mentions, half rumor, half delight, that some flamboyant notaries dusted their quills with ground mica for sparkle. Imagine sunlight hitting your writing tool and throwing a tiny disco across the courtroom wall. Did it distract witnesses? Possibly. Did anyone complain? Probably not to their face. You crouch lower as voices rise. The white quill notary gestures with sharp precision, his feather slicing the air like punctuation. The rainbow quill counters with a lazy flick, all confidence and irony, as if to say, nice argument, but my plume's a poem. There's something gladiatorial about it, no swords, no blood, just ink-born authority locked in a duel of aesthetics and words. And you know what makes it even better? People are watching. A baker's apprentice leans out from a doorway, flour dust ghosting his hair. Two merchants hover by a stack of crates, eyes gleaming like kids at a puppet show. Because this isn't just a fight about paperwork, it's theater. And in a world without Netflix, you take your drama where you can get it. One notary pulls out a scroll, unrolling it with a snap that echoes like a slap. The parchment shimmers in the firelight, a pale battlefield awaiting ink. He slaps it against the wall and, with exaggerated flair, dips his plume into a tiny silver inkwell. His strokes are bold, defiant, looping across the page like the verbal equivalent of a MIC drop. The other watches, smirking, before producing his own scroll, thinner, sleeker, probably imported, because yes, even parchment had tears. He begins writing too, his feather dancing in curves so elegant you'd swear it's choreographed. And here's where your sleepy brain should perk up. These displays weren't always empty posturing. Style could sway perception. A contract penned with confident, flourished script could suggest authority and clarity, even if the terms were the same. Calligraphy wasn't just pretty, it was persuasion inked into form. Historians still debate how far this aesthetic bias tipped legal decisions, but admit it, you'd trust the guy with the swan feather over someone scribbling with a broken crow quill. The alley hums with tension, the scratch of quills weaving into the hiss of distant rain. You feel your heart sinking with that rhythm. It's absurd, you know, grown men dueling with feathers, but also beautiful, because in this sliver of night, you see power distilled to its quietest weapon, ink. Finally, both step back. Two scrolls gleam under the torchlight like rival swords. There's no applause, no handshake, just curt nods and the swish of robes as they vanish into separate shadows, leaving the alley smelling of wax, wine breath, and freshly ground pride. The onlookers melt away too, carrying whispers that will ripple through taverns by dawn. You linger a moment, staring at a single down feather drifting to the ground. It lands softly, a pale comma punctuating the night. And you think about us, about how we still flaunt our tools, the titanium pens, the touchscreen styluses, the gadgets that scream status louder than function. Maybe not much has changed after all. You scoop up that fallen feather in your imagination and follow the path where the white quill notary disappeared. His plume was sharp, disciplined, all business, and something tells you his world holds even stranger secrets. Keep moving. The parchment of this story is still unrolling. You follow the echo of boots into a street that narrows like a throat, the air damp and heavy with the smell of wood smoke and old rain. Somewhere nearby, a dog barks once, then thinks better of it. The white quill notary pushes through a warped oak door, and you slip close enough to catch the briefest glimpse of what lies beyond, a room awash in candlelight, the kind of glow that makes gold look smug and shadows behave badly. You step inside, quiet as a thought, and the first thing that hits you isn't the heat or the hush. It's the smell. Ink. Thick, metallic, almost medicinal, layered with the sweet ghost of beeswax and a hint of mildew clinging to the edges of parchment. You could bottle this aroma and call it Deadline, a medieval fragrance. The room hums with purpose. Notaries aren't lounging tonight, they're in full scribal sprint. Sheets of parchment sprawl across tables like bleached pelts, blotting sand in neat bowls ready for action, quills stacked like lances waiting for battle. You inch closer to a desk and watch as a man bends over a charter, his shoulders rounded like parentheses. His plume dips into the ink, hesitates, then swoops, left, right, curve, leaving letters so tight and orderly they could march in a parade. But then disaster. A sneeze. A sharp, traitorous achoo. The quill jerks mid-stroke, and a glossy black comet splatters across the page. Gasps ripple through the room. The scribe freezes, face blanching like parchment under lime wash. You swear you hear the faint clink of doom as someone mutters a prayer. Mainstream fact alert. Ink blots weren't just ugly, they could invalidate a document. Legal texts demanded clarity, no smears, no smudges, no oops, my bad. Unlike you and your modern Control Plus Z safety net, these folks danced on a tightrope without a net. One slip, and hours, sometimes days, of work drowned in a single drop of ink. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some notaries kept tiny breadcrumbs on hand to blot out wet mistakes. Yep, stale bread. They'd press it gently to soak up the excess like an early, carb-based eraser. Historians still argue whether this was a widespread hack or just the medieval equivalent of life pro tips passed over ale. Either way, it sounds oddly satisfying, doesn't it? You watch the sneezy scribe attempt triage, dabbing furiously with a lump of crust while whispering what you can only assume are words not found in any psalter. It's almost comical, except for the tension pulsing through the room like a drumbeat. Because here, ink isn't ink, it's reputation. Smudge it, and you're not just sloppy, you're suspect. Your eyes wander to the far table, where a man in a hooded robe sharpens his quill with a penknife, curls of feather littering the floor like snow. His calm, methodical, carving the nib to a fine split point. Fun fact hiding under your pillow tonight. The term penknife comes from this very ritual, tiny blades designed not to stab enemies, but to tame feathers into weapons of law. There's poetry in that, don't you think? The soundscape in here could lull you to sleep if it weren't so intense. The rhythmic scratch of quills, the soft rasp of knives, the occasional sigh heavy enough to bend the candles. Every desk is its own island of focus, yet together they form an archipelago of ambition. Historians still argue whether writing rooms like this doubled as informal social hubs or if they were more like temples of silence. Judging by the occasional chuckle and murmured Latin joke you don't understand, you'd bet on the former. Maybe something about how Brother Matteo can't draw a proper ampersand to save his soul. Scribal humor, exclusive, ink-stained, and deadly dull to outsiders. And here's a detail to sweeten your dreams. Some quills were so sharp they could pierce skin with the lightest jab. Accidental finger pricks were common, and superstition bubbled up around them. Blood on the page was an omen. Some saw it as sanctifying the text, others, a curse. You picture a trembling clerk dabbing at a crimson dot, whispering to Saint Jerome for backup. As the night deepens, the room's energy shifts. Candle stubs shrink into molten puddles, ink thickens to molasses, and yet the scribes keep going, eyes red, fingers cramped, posture more pretzel than human. You wonder what drives them. Money? Pride? Maybe the intoxicating power of permanence, that thrill of knowing your words, scratched by feather on skin, might outlive the stones of the city. The sneezy scribe finally gives up, rolls his ruined sheet into a tight, angry scroll, and hurls it toward the hearth. It lands with a hiss, curling like a blackened fern. He grabs a fresh sheet, dips his quill, and starts again, jaws set with the grim resolve of someone who knows failure isn't an option. And you slip back into the cold night, ears still echoing with the hiss of ink and the sigh of parchment. Above, the stars scatter like spilled sand, and for a moment, the sky feels like a vast, unwritten page. You wonder, if these men saw your world of keyboards and instant printouts, would they envy your speed or pity you for losing the romance of the scrape and scratch? Either way, keep walking. There's more to uncover, and something tells you the next stop involves drama thick as fresh ink. The street curves like a question mark, and you follow it until the hum of voices draws you toward a stone archway yawning into darkness. The torches here spit and hiss, their light jittering across faces carved into the walls, grim men with hollow eyes, as if warning you that justice is a fickle thing. You step inside, the sound of your boots swallowed by the vast hush that waits beyond. This isn't a scriptorium anymore. This is a courtroom. Picture the scene, a vaulted chamber that smells of damp limestone and beeswax polish. Benches sag under the weight of merchants, apprentices, and a sprinkling of nobles whose collars gleam like freshly laundered halos. Their whispers rise and fall like a tide, laced with curiosity and barely disguised glee. Because tonight's entertainment isn't a minstrel show or a bear-baiting. It's better. It's legal drama. At the center, two notaries stand opposite each other, and oh, you've met these men before. White Quill and Peacock Quill, reunited for an encore, because apparently, quill duels are a series, not a one-off special. The stakes? A contested contract involving land, vineyards, and enough florins to make a bishop blush. The presiding judge looms above them, his robes like a storm cloud stitched with gold. Now here's your mainstream fact. In medieval courts, notaries weren't just clerks. They were legal rock stars, part lawyer, part scribe, part bureaucratic sorcerer. Their word could legitimize deals, settle disputes, and, in some cases, tilt fortunes. A single flourish of ink could spell triumph or ruin. No wonder they carried their tools like knights bore swords. You edge closer, pressing against a pillar etched with graffiti so ancient it looks like tree rings of human mischief. The judge bangs a wooden mallet, a blunt, unimpressive ancestor of your modern gavel, and proceedings begin. Latin rolls off tongues like honey mixed with gravel. You catch phrases here and there, testimonium, concilium, fides publica. And every time a notary gestures, that giant feather arcs through the air like punctuation turned performance art. And now for your quirky tidbit. There are accounts, half joke, half truth, of notaries sharpening their quills in the middle of a hearing just to intimidate rivals. Imagine the slow, deliberate scrape of blade on feather, the curl of white shavings drifting like snow onto the courtroom floor. Was it petty? Absolutely. Effective? Probably, because psychology is timeless, and a well-timed sharpening says, "I'm ready to write circles around you." The case spirals into a duel of clauses, a fencing match fought with syllables. White Quill cites precedent with icy precision, his script unfurling like a ladder toward victory. Peacock Quill counters with drama, his words dripping with metaphors so lush you can practically smell the vineyards in question. Historians still argue whether medieval rhetoric leaned more on logic or flair, but tonight? Flair is winning hearts, if not minds. The audience loves it. Gasps punctuate the arguments like exclamation marks. Someone drops a goblet, and the clatter barely earns a glance because all eyes are glued to the feathers carving arcs of authority through the torchlight. You can almost hear the silent commentary. That swan quill? Magnificent. Those ink pots? Imported, surely. And you realize something that makes you grin. This is basically a medieval fashion show with footnotes. Then, disaster again. A candle topples near Peacock Quill's side, sending wax splattering across the margin of his document. The crowd inhales sharply. Will he falter? Flinch? No. With a grace that borders on smug, he slides a fresh sheet from his satchel, dips his quill, and resumes writing without missing a beat. You swear you hear someone whisper, "That style," as if the man just walked a catwalk instead of salvaging a legal brief. Meanwhile, White Quill tightens his jaw, his script growing sharper, angrier, letters bristling like soldiers in tight formation. The ink glints under the torchlight, black as crow feathers, and you think if ink had a sound, his would hiss. Historians still debate whether judges secretly enjoyed this kind of spectacle or loathed it with the fire of 1,000 sermons. Some argue these contests eroded dignity, others claim they reinforced the majesty of law through ritualized rivalry. Either way, the judge tonight looks as though he's savoring every syllable. His lips twitch, a flicker of amusement escaping the granite mask. The verdict? It comes like a bell in a fog, measured, solemn, final. White Quill wins by a feather's breadth, his arguments deemed the more canonical. Peacock Quill bows, not in defeat but in theatrical flourish, his plume catching the last lick of torchlight like a dying star. The crowd exhales, a living sigh, and the chamber swells with chatter as people spill into the night, hungry for gossip and ale. You linger, your breath fogging in the cooling air, and watch as both notaries pack up their arsenals. Scrolls rolled, ink sealed, feathers tucked like restless birds waiting for the next flight. You wonder, were they rivals by necessity, or friends offstage sharing wine and laughter over how easily people fall for a well-curved letter? You'll never know. But one truth feels solid under your boots. These men understood something eternal, that power isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's the quiet scrape of a nib across skin, the elegance of a line drawn straight and sure. You step outside into a night glazed with frost, the moon hanging like a coin flipped by fate. Somewhere behind you, a feather drifts from an open window, pale against the dark, and you imagine it whispering as it falls, "This story isn't finished." And you believe it. Because if courts can turn quills into weapons, what other secrets does this feathered world keep tucked in its margins? Better keep walking. The parchment ahead is far from blank. The morning air smells of hay and smoke, a sharp contrast to the soot and ink tang of the courtroom. You follow the notary through a bustling marketplace where vendors shout prices like sermons, spilling grains, fabrics, and strange little trinkets onto cobblestones slick with dew. You notice a distinct rhythm here, chaos tempered by ritual, the clamor folded into the meticulous hum of commerce, like a symphony with every note slightly off-kilter. And then you spot it, a pen merchant hawking feathers as if they were rare gemstones. Goose, swan, even crow. He gestures theatrically toward his wares, shouting, "Quills for every hand." Every contract deserves a perfect feather. The notary pauses, plucks one with a practiced flick, and tests it against his thumb. It flexes just right. You almost want to cheer, because here it is again, the tool as badge of craft, the object that elevates a man above ordinary scribbles. Here's a mainstream fact. In the Middle Ages, notaries often sourced their own quills. They had preferences: hard quills for fine lines, soft quills for broad strokes. Certain bird feathers were prized for specific functions. Swan, smooth, regal, ideal for ceremonial documents. Goose, reliable and versatile. Crow, cheap, hardy, sometimes used for rough drafts or mundane business. Each quill wasn't just a tool, it was an extension of the notary's hand, personality, and reputation. Quirky tidbit incoming. Some quills were even seasoned by soaking in salt water or vinegar to make them more flexible. Others were trimmed in a way that mimicked the writer's signature style. Historians still argue whether these techniques were widely taught or passed down as trade secrets. Either way, it's fascinating to imagine a notary treating his feather like a personal talisman, coaxing it into perfection before a single contract is signed. You watch the notary wind his way through the market, quill in one hand, inkpot tucked securely under his arm, leather satchel swaying. He stops at a stall selling parchment scraps, haggles, and selects a thick sheet with a nod. Every item he touches, quills, ink, parchment, is part of an unspoken ritual. This is preparation, devotion, artistry. The stakes aren't just legal, they're existential. One slip, one poorly chosen feather, and the document, the transaction, and potentially the reputation of all involved could falter. The merchants barely notice him. Maybe they do, maybe they don't, but a whisper passes among some onlookers. That's the man with the swan feather. He doesn't miss a stroke. And in a society so dependent on written proof, that kind of reputation is gold. The feather, now, functions almost like a public ID card. No quill. No credibility. No credibility. No business. You trail him to a small barn on the edge of town. The smell of hay, sweat, and something faintly sour fills the air. Here, he unrolls his parchment with care, dips his quill, and begins drafting what looks like a lease agreement for a vineyard. His hand moves with a rhythm that seems almost musical, each stroke deliberate, confident, and balanced. You're mesmerized by how the quill arcs, twists, and leaves black trails that are both words and statements of power. Historians still argue whether notaries truly believed their feather choice affected outcomes or whether it was a social signal. Probably a little of both. But you can't help noticing the subtle interplay: the quill, the parchment, the inkwell, and the subtle bowing of tradition all converge to form authority. It's theatre, yes, but theatre with teeth. Outside, the world moves on. A cart rattles past, a child chases a chicken, the wind tugs at your cloak. You realize, watching the notary work, that every legal transaction in this town, every promise and debt, owes a debt to that one feather, the same feather that jingled like a bell, that sliced the air like a sword, that turned ordinary ink into law. And just like that, history feels tactile, almost alive. You step back into the sunlit street, the scent of hay lingering in your nose, and follow him again, knowing the road ahead is long, dangerous, and ink-stained. And yet, somehow, it feels like a privilege. Because in a world where quills can sway courts, every step carries weight, and every feather leaves a legacy. You trail the notary along a winding lane, the air growing cooler as the sun dips behind distant rooftops. Smoke from chimney stacks coils into the sky, mingling with the faint scent of wet straw and bread baking in ovens. The notary carries his satchel and plume with the kind of confident ease that suggests he's done this walk 1,000 times, though in reality, every step carries the silent risk of misfortune: a rogue horse, a slippery cobblestone, or the occasional pickpocket. And yet, he walks like royalty, quill swinging like a scepter, every movement deliberate. The feather isn't just for show, it's a tool honed for efficiency. The way he handles it tells you he knows the balance between authority and aesthetics. One twitch of the wrist and a contract is drafted, a signature emphasized, a margin aligned. It's a dance performed in ink and plumage. Mainstream fact: medieval notaries were highly mobile. They traveled between towns, courts, and monasteries, often carrying portable ink, parchment, and multiple quills. Their work required speed, precision, and an understanding of local laws. A misstep could invalidate documents, which meant livelihood and reputation were literally in their hands, or rather, their feathers. Here's a quirky tidbit: some notaries trained carrier pigeons to transport messages or drafts over short distances. Imagine combining quills, ink, and birds like a medieval messaging app. Historians still argue whether this was common practice or a niche curiosity, but the ingenuity speaks volumes about their adaptability. You follow him past a small chapel, noting the way his plume catches the torchlight of an early evening service. A monk glances at the feather, eyebrows raising slightly. Inside, prayers echo, but your notary doesn't pause, business waits for no one. The contrast is striking. Here, faith moves at the rhythm of whispered devotion, while outside, law is written with flamboyant efficiency and dramatic flair. The notary stops at a modest merchant's house. Two children peek around the doorway, curious and wide-eyed, as he sets down his satchel. The quill, still enormous, leans like a proud sentinel against the wall. He unrolls parchment, dips his feather, and begins drafting a transaction, a loan for a shipment of wool. Every stroke of the quill is confident, deliberate, and carries weight. Historians still argue whether the notary's presence alone swayed agreements or if the legality depended solely on the document. Either way, the aura created by the oversized feather seems to settle matters before ink even touches the page. There's an almost magical quality to this. The quill doesn't just record law, it commands attention, respect, even obedience. And the subtle humor. The quill is so large it occasionally knocks over a candle, or tangles with the satchel strap, and you can't help but picture the notary's inner monologue, a minor inconvenience for the sake of prestige. Because for all its grandeur, the feather demands care and awareness. It's a tool, a weapon, and a status symbol rolled into one. By the time the loan is signed, the sun has vanished, replaced by a sky dusted with stars. The notary packs his materials, adjusts his plume, and steps into the quiet lane, the feather swaying with every stride. You follow, realizing that in this world of ink, parchment, and oversized quills, every day is a journey, every contract a performance, and every feather an emblem of authority, tradition, and personality. The night stretches ahead like a sheet of fresh parchment, blank but full of potential. You wonder what awaits around the next bend, a feud, a treaty, or simply another quill waiting to be wielded with power and grace. The lane twists into a forested edge where shadows curl like ink stains across the ground. The notary moves with certainty, boots crunching frost and fallen leaves, his feather quill a pendulum marking the rhythm of your pursuit. You can't help but notice how it arcs with each step, a silent declaration of presence. I am here. I write. I decide. You think about why the plume feels so important. It isn't just show. It's authority, mobility, and a bit of intimidation rolled into one elongated feather. One flash of it, and merchants, clients, or officials immediately recognize the man carrying the power to record their promises, debts, and secrets for all time. Lose the quill, and you lose legitimacy. In a world built on written contracts and official seals, the feather is part of the uniform, part of the ritual, and part of the performance. Mainstream fact: many notaries in the late Middle Ages were required to carry portable writing sets, including ink, sand for blotting, and multiple quills. These tools allowed them to perform their duties anywhere, from bustling squares to rural barns. Travel was constant, and preparation was essential. A missing quill could mean a delayed transaction or worse. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some notaries carved tiny personal motifs into the shafts of their quills, a flower, an initial, or even a subtle doodle. It was both a mark of authorship and a way to detect forgery. Historians still argue whether this was widespread or just practiced by particularly obsessive scribes, but the thought of a medieval doodle on a feather is oddly charming. The forest thickens, and you notice the notary pausing by a narrow stream. He dips a scrap of cloth into the water, mops the bottom of his inkpot, and mutters something under his breath, probably a quick prayer to Saint Jerome, patron of scribes. It's a small ritual, practical and superstitious at once. You imagine how many documents in history owe their survival not just to careful hands but to whispered incantations over tiny inkwells. Historians still argue whether superstition actually guided notarial work or if it was just a comforting tradition, but either way, the symbolism is potent. A feather, ink, and a whispered prayer become a triad of power, proof, authority, and divine oversight. You continue alongside the notary as he navigates the edge of the woods, quill tucked securely under his arm, inkpots safely stashed. A fox darts across the path, eyes glowing in the dim light, and for a moment you imagine it judging your choice to follow this feather-wielding figure through mud, frost, and darkness. He doesn't flinch, doesn't hesitate. This is routine. His confidence is contagious. Even in silence, the feather proclaims, "I belong to a system older than most houses in this village." And then you see it, a small homestead tucked behind a grove of birches. Smoke curls lazily from the chimney, and warm light spills from the windows. This is the next client, probably expecting a draft or contract to seal an agreement. The notary straightens, adjusts his quill, and steps forward, plume catching the last streaks of twilight. You trail close enough to hear the rustle of parchment and the soft dip of feather in ink, and you realize the rhythm of his day is inseparable from the rhythm of his feather. Every step, every dip, every flourish serves a purpose. Authority, legality, and artistry merge seamlessly. The quill is at once tool and talisman, instrument and badge, whispering, "This document matters. I matter. Your promises now have weight." You marvel at how a simple feather could hold so much power, and at the quiet drama of a world that placed such trust in ink, skin, and the touch of a master hand. And with that, the notary begins to write, and you follow, silent but attentive, knowing that the next page of history is about to be inscribed. You trudge behind the notary as he leaves the homestead, quill swaying like a metronome, keeping time with his determined pace. The moon is higher now, pale and insistent, casting long shadows that twist and sway over the path like ink smudges come to life. Every so often, the feather catches a stray beam and seems almost alive, as though the plume itself is aware of the weight it carries, legal, social, and symbolic. It strikes you that travel wasn't just about distance. Notaries moved through networks of trust, reputation, and subtle power plays. A misstep along this road could ripple, contracts could be delayed, arguments could spiral, and the status of entire families might be jeopardized. And all the while, the feather is your constant visual reminder of who commands authority. Lose it, and suddenly the official seal becomes questionable. Mainstream fact: medieval notaries often held authority that transcended their immediate city. Their notarized documents were recognized across multiple jurisdictions, and guilds kept strict records to ensure authenticity. This mobility meant that a traveling notary wasn't merely a clerk, he was a conduit of law and order, and a single document carried the weight of multiple governing bodies. Here's a quirky twist. Some notaries were rumored to dip their quills in unusual liquids, wine, diluted vinegar, or herbal tinctures, to improve flow or preserve the tip. Historians still argue whether these practices were practical or simply apocryphal, but it does give a fascinating insight into the obsessive care devoted to these tools. You can almost imagine a notary whispering, "Just a touch of rosemary for clarity," before leaning in to draft a contract. As you follow him through a small village square, you notice the reactions of passers-by. Farmers pause, a child tugs at his mother's sleeve, and merchants glance up from their stalls. The quill commands attention even when the notary isn't speaking, a silent assertion of authority that turns every step into a miniature procession. It's not just a tool, it's a statement. Historians still debate whether the theatricality of feather size and color influenced outcomes in disputes. Did a more elaborate quill give the impression of competence, swaying undecided witnesses or clients? Probably. Human psychology doesn't change much over centuries. You picture a medieval courtroom, a plain quill, a simple contract, and the subtle nods of approval granted to the one whose feather simply looks more official. The notary pauses at a well, dipping his hand into the cold water and wiping the tip of his quill with a scrap of cloth. Ritual meets practicality. He checks his ink, adjusts his satchel, and moves on with deliberate steps. You notice that the quill is not just a writing tool, it's a rhythm guide, an extension of his mind and his authority. As the night deepens, the road narrows again, flanked by hedgerows. The distant hoot of an owl punctuates the quiet, and you realize that every sound seems amplified in the hush of the countryside. The notary walks steadily, quill balanced with an almost artistic precision, and you follow, aware that this simple instrument has dictated much more than ink on parchment. It has orchestrated movement, attention, and respect. Finally, a distant glow ahead signals the next settlement. Smoke rises from a few chimneys, lanterns flicker behind small windows, and the quiet tension of travel shifts into the anticipation of another contract, another performance of authority, another chapter in the endless choreography between feather, ink, and human ambition. You trudge into the village, quill bobbing like a tiny flag of power with every step. The cobblestones glisten under lantern light, slick from the evening mist, and the air carries the combined sense of wood smoke, livestock, and baking bread. You realize this is a crossroads, not just of roads, but of stories, commerce, and promises, all tied together by ink and feather. The notary stops at a timber-framed inn where the door creaks open before he touches it. Inside, the warmth hits you like a wave, firelight flickering across walls, low murmurs of conversation, and the smell of stew that promises comfort. He sets down his satchel and quill with deliberate care, almost reverently, as if placing a crown atop the table. Patrons glance up, some nodding in recognition. The feather is not subtle. It announces his authority without a single word. Mainstream fact: notaries were not merely record keepers, they were legal intermediaries. Their authority allowed them to draft contracts, witness agreements, and create documents that could be enforced in courts far beyond their local town. In a world where literacy was limited, the quill was a conduit of power, and the notary's presence could lend legitimacy to even the simplest transaction. Quirky tidbit: some notaries were said to preen their quills before long writing sessions, stroking the feathers and occasionally adding decorative flourishes. Think of it as primping before a grand performance, less vanity, more ritual. Historians still argue whether these habits influenced public perception or were simply personal superstitions, but the image is delightful, a medieval professional giving their feather a pep talk. You watch him carefully prepare a sheet of parchment, smoothing it until it gleams under the candlelight. Then, with ink carefully measured and quill poised, he begins drafting an intricate rental agreement for a small plot of land. Each stroke seems deliberate, almost musical, punctuated by the faint scratch of the nib against prepared skin. You notice the villagers leaning in, unconsciously holding their breath, aware that this small ceremony of writing carries consequences. Historians still debate whether the flourish of a quill could subtly influence interpretation of a contract. Could a confident stroke inspire trust? Could a shaky line sound doubt? In any case, the notary's mastery of his tool commands respect, and you can see that every letter, every curve, every deliberate spacing is part of a larger performance, a guarantee of authority, an assurance of permanence. As he works, the feather occasionally brushes against his sleeve, or dips too low and threatens to blot the page, prompting quick, almost unconscious corrections. You realize the feather isn't just symbolic, it's demanding attention. Carelessness could ruin a contract, a relationship, even the reputation of the notary himself. It's an intimate dance of skill, patience, and the relentless insistence of craft. By the time he finishes, the document is complete, black ink shining on pale parchment, lines straight, margins precise, a testament to both skill and ritual. The notary rolls it carefully, seals it, and tucks it into his satchel. Villagers exhale as if released from a spell. The feather bobs in his hand one last time before being stowed, still commanding respect, still asserting presence. You step back into the night, the inn's warmth fading behind you, the path ahead stretching into darkness. And somewhere in the quiet, you realize the truth: the feather is never just a writing instrument. It is authority, mobility, artistry, and performance rolled into a single, majestic plume. Every contract, every agreement, Every tiny stroke of ink carries centuries of trust, power, and human ingenuity. The village disappears behind you, replaced by a winding path through fields heavy with dew. Your boots sink slightly into the soft earth, the night air crisp against your cheeks. The notary marches ahead, his quill tucked under his arm like a baton guiding an invisible orchestra, each step measured, purposeful. The weight of the feather seems almost palpable, a constant reminder that this is no ordinary walk, it's a procession, a ritual, a quiet assertion of authority in motion. You think back on the day's journey, the scribbling, the dramatic courtroom, the market, the farmhouse. Each stop a small stage for the dance of ink and feather, each contract a tiny earthquake of promise and duty. The quill has been both weapon and shield, a signal to peers and clients alike that this man's words are binding, eternal, and unassailable. It's absurd when you step back and think about it, yet profoundly logical in a world built on documents rather than digital backups. Mainstream fact: notaries were often required to carry multiple quills and ink supplies precisely because travel was unpredictable. A bent or broken feather could halt a transaction or, worse, invalidate an agreement. Their tools were mobile offices, and the feather was the crown jewel. Without it, the notary's authority was diminished. Quirky tidbit: some notaries even kept tiny scrapbooks of feathers from previous contracts, a tactile diary of work completed. Historians still argue whether this was widespread or just a peculiar habit of obsessive scribes, but the image is irresistible, like a Pokémon card collection of legal instruments. As the path narrows and the trees close in, the notary pauses to adjust his satchel, the quill swaying gently. A fox crosses ahead, briefly halting your procession as if it too recognizes the power carried by the feather. You think about all the roads, inns, and fields this quill has touched, the silent authority it has conferred on agreements across countless villages. It's more than a tool, it's a living emblem of the notary's craft and reputation. Historians still debate how much the physical size of a quill influenced perception. Did a longer, more dramatic feather really command more respect, or is this an exaggeration of anecdotal accounts? Either way, the theatricality of the plume has clearly left its mark on both history and imagination. Night deepens as you follow him through a final stretch of open fields. The wind carries the faint scent of hay, and stars scatter across the sky like spilled ink on a parchment. You realize that each feathered quill, each carefully scribed contract, has shaped lives, towns, and destinies in ways invisible yet undeniable. It isn't just about writing, it's about presence, authority, and permanence. Eventually, the notary stops at a small stone bridge overlooking a silent stream. He kneels, dips the feather into a small pot of ink for one final flourish, and carefully inscribes a note on a scrap of parchment. It's a minor task, almost ceremonial, yet you understand its gravity. Even the smallest stroke matters. The feather arcs gracefully, catching moonlight, and you feel the weight of history settle around you. As you take a deep breath of the cold night air, it hits you, this world of ink, parchment, and oversized quills is as meticulous as it is magical. Every document was a dance of trust, skill, and ritual. Every feather carried authority. And in following this notary, you've glimpsed the quiet power of a tool, a man, and a system built on permanence, respect, and human ingenuity. The journey winds down, the quill tucked safely back in the satchel, the night stretching around you. You can almost hear the faint whisper of centuries of contracts, the echo of promises secured by feathers, and the weight of tradition carried forward by simple tools in skilled hands. And you know this, the story of the feather is a story of humanity's need to record, to control, and to leave something behind, black ink on pale skin, forever etched into history. The road softens beneath your feet, shadows stretching longer, fading into a gentle haze. The notary's steps slow, and you feel the weight of the day lifting as the air cools and the moon drifts higher, casting silvery patterns across the fields. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the soft slap of boots against damp earth, becomes a lullaby of history, steady and soothing. You breathe in the quiet, letting it fill you, feeling the tension of hours spent trailing, observing, imagining, slowly dissolve. The feather, once so commanding, now rests gently in its satchel, silent, dignified, yet still carrying its unspoken authority. You picture it, poised above parchment, ready to give permanence to words, yet resting peacefully now, the work completed, the story nearly told. The night itself seems to soften, every star a gentle punctuation in the dark sky, a reminder that time moves slowly when you pause to observe it. You reflect on all the contracts, agreements, and small dramas inked with these enormous feathers, the weight of human trust carried in delicate strokes. It feels comforting. Some things are deliberate, measured, enduring. Some tools, some traditions, linger quietly, shaping lives long after the noise has faded. Your thoughts slow further, drifting with the steady cadence of memory and imagination. The notary's path winds forward, but you feel a gentle tug to rest, to absorb the meticulous beauty of his world, and the quiet authority of a feather that was never just a tool, it was an emblem of care, precision, and presence. You let your mind settle into the rhythm of history, the hush of parchment and ink, and allow your eyes to close gently, imagining the soft scratch of quills as a lullaby that spans centuries. And with that, you feel yourself sink comfortably into the calm, the soft pulse of a world that moves slowly, deliberately, and beautifully. The feather rests, the ink sleeps, and you too can rest, wrapped in the quiet magic of tradition, permanence, and the gentle flow of stories written long ago but still echoing tonight.